Welcome to Lesson 1-3, Multiplying Decimals. Today we're going to talk about how to find the product of decimals and whole numbers, decimals and decimals, how to use the associative property of multiplication, the commutative property of multiplication, the identity property of multiplication, and the zero property. Right, so the first thing we have to look at is how we typically multiply numbers. So when I line up 12 times 65, I take the ones digit and line it up with the ones digit, tens and line up with tens. So I line up the right side. Then I take this column and I do 12 times 5, 3 times 5 is 10. Carry the 1, 1 times 5 is 5, plus 1 is 6. Now that I'm done with the 5, I have to add a 0. 2 times 6 is 12. Carry the 1, 1 times 6 is 6, plus 1 is 7, and then I add those numbers together. 6 times 6 plus 2 is 8. So my answer is 780. Right, when we line up this next one, we continue to line up that last digit. No matter how many digits there are, we line up that last digit. This is going to be important to remember when we talk about lining up our decimals. To find the product when multiplying a decimal by a decimal, first you line up your numbers on the right side. So you don't worry where the decimal is, you just line up that right side. So in this case, since we're doing 2 tenths times 6 tenths, you line up the 2 and the 6. Okay, and make sure as you're doing this, you're writing in your examples each step as we go. So here's step 1, then you're going to need step 2. Step 2, ignore the decimal and multiply. So basically take out that decimal and multiply. And in this case, we get 2 times 6 is 12. Carry the 1. 0 times 6 is 0, plus 1 is 1. We're done with the 6. Add that 0. 2 times 0 is 0. 0 times 0 is 0. We add all those together. So you should have all of this here for step 2. Okay, and then the third step, place your decimal. So to place our decimal, we count how many numbers we have after the decimals. That's how far to the left you put your decimal. So what this means is I have a 2 after the decimal and I have a 6 after the decimal. That's 2 numbers. So I take my decimal and I start it on the right hand side and I move it 1, 2 places to the left. So my answer is 0 and 12 hundredths. I know it seems a little bit odd that our number actually got smaller when you think of decimals, but this is how multiplying by decimals works. So you take 2 tenths, so here's 2 tenths in our case, and you take 6 tenths. And the area that they have shaded in together is your answer. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 that are shaded in together. Therefore, our answer is 12 hundredths because that's how many it's out of. Alright, so now we are going to talk about how to multiply decimals by whole numbers. So again, you're going to want to make sure to fill out all the examples here and all your steps here. Your steps actually are not that different at all. Line up your numbers on the right hand side. So even though 12 doesn't have a decimal, you're going to line up the 2 and the 6. This makes multiplying easier so you don't have so many zeros in your product. Step 2, ignore the decimal and multiply. So it's kind of like I'm just going to multiply 12 times 16. 2 times 6 is 12, carry the 1. 1 times 6 is 6, plus 1 is 7. Okay, I'm done with the 6, I'm done with that 1. So I put the 0 as my placeholder, 2 times 1 is 2, 1 times 1 is 1, add those together. And then again, the same thing, we place our decimal by counting how many numbers are after a decimal. Since there's only one number after a decimal, we only move our decimal one place to the left. So my answer is 19 and 2/10. Right, so what I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to go ahead and try these 3 problems on your own, and when you come back, we'll go over your answers. Right, so for this first problem, you should have gotten 16 and 5/10. You line up the 1 and the 5, ignore the decimal, 1 times 5 is 5, 1 times 5 is 5, use 0 as a placeholder, 1 times 1 is 1, 1 times 1 is 1, add those together and you get 165. You have one number after a decimal, move the decimal one place to the left, you get 16 and 5/10. Okay, you can go ahead and check your work against mine. If you got it incorrect, I'd like you to try it again before moving on to the next page. Right, so we talked about the associative property of addition. Now we're going to talk about the associative property of multiplication. So what does 5 times the quantity 10 times 2 equal? We know we have to do 10 times 2 first, which gives us 20, and then we do 20 times 5. But what if we did 5 times 10 first, and then multiplied by 20? So in this case, it gave us 100. 5 times 10 is 50, times 2 is 100. So what can we conclude about this associative property of multiplication? If you remember from the associative property of addition, we can change the groupings of these numbers, and it will not change the outcome. So the associative property of multiplication is changing the grouping of the factors does not change the product. So 3 times the quantity 4 times 5 is the same as the quantity 3 times 4 times 5. So you might be thinking, well, why do we do this? It doesn't make any sense just to move the groupings. You're going to multiply and get the same answer. We want to make things as easy as we can on ourselves. And so when we're talking about math, we like to make math easier to do in our head. So in this case, if I have to do 4 times 12, I know that that's 48. But if I have to do 48 times 5, now I have to take out my pen and write down 48 times 5. Well, if I'm at the grocery store and I'm trying to figure this out, I don't have a pen and paper to write this down. So in order to quickly get it done, I can take the parentheses and I can move them to put the 5 times 4 in parentheses, so I have to do that first. So I know that 5 times 4 is 20, and then I have to multiply that by 12. I can easily do this because this 0 makes multiplying way less complicated for us. We ignore the 0 and do 2 times 12, which I know is 24, and then because I have this 1 0, I add 1 0 to the end of my answer, and my answer is 240. I could have done all this in my head without showing you any of this work, but I wanted you to understand and see what it is that we're trying to do and how we're making this easier to do in your head. The commutative property of multiplication. So what does 10 times 2 equal? Well, we should all know this, that it is 20. So what about 2 times 10? That should give us 20. But now what I really want to make sure that we focus on is if we have 10 divided by 2, what does that give us? Everybody should be yelling 5 at the computer right now, because now we're going to look at what does 2 divided by 10 give us. If you're telling me that 2 divided by 10 gives us 5, you are incorrect. 2 divided by 10 is actually going to give us a decimal because we're taking two things and splitting it into all kinds of different little pieces. Okay, so it does not work that way. 2 divided by 10 is not 5. So when we talk about the commutative property of multiplication, you have to understand that this only works with multiplication, as does the associative property. And we have to be careful with how we multiply or with how we divide things, because flipping the numbers around does not always allow us to get the same answer, and it never allows us to get the same answer if we use the commutative property. So the commutative property of multiplication tells us that we can change the order of the factors and not change the product. So if I do 7 times 9, it's going to give me the same thing as 9 times 7. Again, why do we do this? We want to make it easier to do in our head. So I want you to take a look at this problem and figure out, how can I make this problem easier to do in my head, and how can I rearrange the numbers? So I know that you have this. I know that you have this in your notes. I want you to rearrange these and think about how it makes it easier to do in your head. Same thing as when we add. You want to get to a multiple of 10. It makes things easier to add together. So if I can move the 12 and the 2, instead of doing 5 times 12, which might be a little bit more complicated for us, we can do 5 times 2, which is 10. 10 times 12 is going to give me 120, because I can use that rule of ignoring the 0. 1 times 12 is 12, and I add 1 0 to the end. What number is the only number that you can multiply to any other number and get the exact same number for an answer? If you are telling me 0, you are incorrect. You are thinking about adding. If you multiply any number by 0, you are not going to get that same number back. The only number that can do that for us is 1. Okay, so the identity property of multiplication tells us that 5 times 1 is 5, 2 times 1 is 2, 100 times 1 is 100. So anytime we multiply a number by 1, it's going to give us itself. So the identity property of multiplication is the product of any number, and 1 is that number. So no matter what you multiply 1 by, it's going to give that same answer back. Okay, and then the last property that we are going to go over is the 0 property. The 0 property tells us that the product of any number in 0 is 0. Okay, so 4 and 2 tenths times 0 is going to equal 0. 0 and 2 tenths times 0 is going to give us 0. 100 times 0 is going to give us 0. So anytime that you see something multiplied by 0, so even if it's 8 different numbers in a row, 8 times 0 times 1 times 14 times 100, it's going to give you 0, because this gives you 0. And then that 0 times 1 will give you 0. The 0 times 14 will give you 0. And then that 0 times 100 will give you 0. So if you ever see a 0 in there with multiplication, it's going to give you 0. Right, so on Edmodo tonight, what I would like you to post, I would like you to try using the commutative property and the associative property of multiplication, and I want you to make these problems easier to do on your own. So 12, sorry, 10 times 2 times 2 times 13 times 15. So that's your first problem. Two Right, so I want you to show me how you will rearrange these numbers to make them easier to do in your head. And then the last problem I would like you to do is to multiply these decimals together. As always, if you have any questions, please make sure to post them out in Modo so we can go over them in class tomorrow.